Hi, my name is Phoebe Wilby. I'm an author. Welcome to my YouTube channel, My Point of View. Hello. Today I'm going to read another story from my short story collection, Point of View. It's all relative, really. This one is called Fiery Angels. Joe's cottage under the fig tree is the only place where I can find refuge and solace. No one else comes here now. The hubbub and bedlam of the main house are not audible, and this is a place where I can relax. I've tried to make sense of what happened. I look at Joe's things and read her diary, trying to see the truth of that day in my mind, trying to make the numbness go away so I can live again. In one hand I hold the collection of notebooks that was Joe's diary. On the wall is the last sketch she was working on. Looking from one to the other only adds to my confusion. I have read the diaries and studied Joe's many sketches numerous times over the weeks since her disappearance, but there's no sense in any of it. I now treasure those pictures and chide myself on my blindness. Why did I not know of her talent sooner? Why did I not take the time to interpret the pictures, the feelings she had, the pain she must have been feeling? I may have been able to reach her. Now it is too late. I close my eyes and see Joe's peaceful face as a host of fiery beings carry her aloft, upward on wings of fire, to God only knows where, or why, or how. We moved to the country nearly 3 years ago to escape the city smog and noise and to provide a better life for the children. There was no smog here, but the noise of the rural environment abounded. There were shops nearby too, if you didn't mind paying the exorbitant prices they demanded in the country. You could do a decent shop in the main town, nearly an hour's drive away, and that was where we usually went. We hadn't planned to shop as often as we used to, yet somehow we managed to do just that. How naive we really were, Jeremy and I. We believed we could be totally self-sufficient, growing the fruit and vegetables and the grains we would need, and keeping a few head of cattle for milk and meat and chickens for eggs and Sunday roasts. There was nothing wrong with the theory, but fruit trees take forever to bear. Planting a vegetable garden was more hard work than we imagined, though we did persevere. And at first, the chooks ate the eggs. Our first crop of wheat was a booming success, the second a failure. We never did plant a third. We did, however, manage to provide all our milk, and through that, butter, cheese of a sort, and yogurt. Success! The cattle for meat didn't work too well, though how could we kill the children's pets? Yes, the children. They thoroughly enjoyed the experience at first. For so long they were caged in their suburban backyard like the chickens in the coop. Now they had the freedom to move, to breathe, to be. 2 teachers taught at the nearest school that was only down the road, and the children would either ride their bicycles or walk. The heat bothered them too, of course, but the chance to explore overrode their discomfort. The school situation worried me. As with any parent, I wanted the best for my children. Would the education I valued so highly for my children be jeopardized, with only 2 teachers shared among 7 grades? My fears turned out to be nothing more substantial than a nightmare when I saw the tremendous progress each had made. I had 3 attending that first year, with 1 leaving for high school and another joining the primary school the next year. The farm chores did not faze them. The older girls took turns at the milking, feeding the chickens, collecting the eggs, and helping in the garden. Sometimes I had to weed the wheat paddock, but only in the beginning to eradicate the thistles that grew in abundance. The younger children had no responsibility, but could help as I saw fit. Generally the chores never lasted long, and the rest of the time was their own. There were old sheds on the property that were still sturdy enough for the children to play in, on and around, and these provided the ready-made cubby houses they enjoyed so much. Joe particularly loved these old buildings. One was by an old Moreton Bay fig. Its gnarled and knotty trunk and branches made for excellent climbing. The tree's old branches overhung the shed's roof, creating a coolness unmatched in the main house. Yet Joe could often be found on the roof, staring into space. She never heard my approach, and it was often several minutes before I could tear her attention away from her own private thoughts. I believe the shed used to be a stable. To Joe it was her own log cabin. It had been her dream to convert it into a miniature house with windows and a door with a real lock. She said she wanted to live in it, coming into the main house only to eat and bathe. Had the shed been big enough, she would have preferred to do those things there too. I know a mother should not have favourites, but if I had one it was Joe. She looked more like me than the other children, though much prettier than I ever was. Where her brothers and sisters were all varying shades of fair, her hair was raven. She had freckled skin, a trait all my children picked up from somewhere. Her green eyes were flecked with tawny brown, and while she was by no means skinny, her body was well toned and proportionate. She was built for the country. It suited her. Jo was good at her schoolwork, the star pupil, her teacher would tell me. I had loved school, and also done well. I also had once lived in a private world of my own making. I often used to wonder how I could have married and had so many children when I valued my privacy so much. I used to worry about Jo's need for privacy and wonder if she would choose to give it up as I had done. Yet there were many ways in which Jo and I were totally different. She loved to sketch. I had not really taken much of an interest in her sketches, not until much later. They were beautiful in a childlike way, yet more mature than her 13 years could portray. Where her maturity came from was a mystery. She sketched in pencil views from the roof of her cabin, both real and imaginary. The real ones were stark in their exactness and dedication to detail. The ramshackle chicken coop, the old milking bale, which we still used then, the drying up dam, the endless paddocks and hills with their waving spidery grasses and knotty gums, all took on stark beauty under the guiding light of her pencil. The imaginary ones were mostly the same scenes, but new and vibrant, as if she had been there when they were first created. Knotty gums were young and sprightly, branches and leaves waved gently in the fresh breezes, and the grasses were green and springy. Beautiful, unblemished animals dotted her landscapes, capering in the joy of living, the pleasure of being. Looking at them, I could feel young again. I found it hard to believe my solemn, introverted daughter hid such feeling behind her self-imposed mask. She kept a diary. I never found that until it was too late. Could I have prevented what happened? I used to think so, but I know better now. Still, I know I will always blame myself. She relied on me, but in a very real way I was not there for her. Yet I loved her, she was my favourite, and close as we were, she never confided in me. She preferred to write it all so eloquently in a series of little notebooks with spiral spines and speckled yellowed cardboard covers. I don't think I ever kept anything from my mother, but Jo felt the need to keep her deepest feelings, joys, hurts and pains all to herself. The diary provided me with a wealth of information about my daughter. I learned she loathed school. She found the formal structure allowed for no freedom of expression. She never felt she could express herself in creative writing and art classes. The lessons were too stilted and the topics assigned were not to her liking. Learning was fun, but Jo would rather do it her way. I had no clue she felt that way. She was a loner, now that I already knew. She knew everyone at the school, though how could you not in a school with a total population of 36? But they were not all friends. We were newcomers in a tight-knit community, and Jo was different from the rest. When I looked honestly, I could see that she lacked friends. She never asked me if she could go to someone else's home, or to invite someone over. Her brother's friends nearly lived at our house after school, and her older sister was always over at Mandy's doing one thing or another. Yet Jo remained alone. I thought it was by choice, and perhaps in a way it was. I don't believe Jo saw it that way. She loved her little cottage and valued the time she could spend there. I already knew that too, but what she wrote about that old shed helped me to see how much it really meant to her. It was more than her refuge, it was her world. Her entire days, nights, weekends revolved around her own little cottage with a tin roof under the Moreton Bay fig. Her chores were done speedily so she could return to her niche. She slept soundly at night so she could enjoy the rooftop and sketch her world with freshness and eagerness. She endured school so she could retreat to her cottage and reflect on the events of the day. She did her extra weekend chores, endured family trips, and helped me a little more, all to relax in privacy at the bottom of the house garden, across from the chickens and a whole galaxy away from her family. I don't believe she would have been able to express her individuality as she did had we stayed where we were in the city suburbs, though had we stayed, her complete unconventionality would not have been so pronounced. Yet for all the feeling revealed in her diaries, I cannot discover what caused her to feel this way. I know how she felt, but not why. I cannot remember when I first began to notice Jo's behaviour changing. Perhaps because she was always so very different, the changes seemed to blend into her natural persona in such a way as to hide any real problems. I do remember receiving a phone call from Mr. James, her teacher, and the principal of the school, sometime before the end of the second term of her second year there. She would have been in grade 7 at the time, preparing to enter high school and working hard as she always did. I was shocked to realise Mr. James knew my daughter well enough to recognise unnatural behavioural patterns I, as her mother, did not. Joe was beginning to fall asleep in class. On the surface, why should that be worrying? Mr. James knew the home responsibilities Joe had, the increased homework load, and possible pressure she was under. The main problem seemed to be that while she fell asleep easily, in a mere 2 or 3 minutes, she would be in such a deep sleep that it was impossible to wake her without drawing the attention of the entire upper school. Joe's embarrassment was profound, and Mr. James, being a sensitive teacher, tried to spare her that. I promised to look into the matter, but with one thing or another I completely forgot for a month or 2. Besides, although Jo was going to bed much earlier, her chores were still being done, as was her homework. When I allowed myself to think of it, I could see no problem, and concluded Mr. James may have been at fault. Perhaps more interesting lessons were needed for her. Perhaps he could have given her a little more free rein in creative writing and art classes. Perhaps all she needed was a little mental stimulation. Perhaps I could shift the blame to someone else. Then the holidays came. Jo's chores were still being done, and she spent her spare time in her cottage. I assumed everything was back to normal. How could I be so wrong? It was about a month after these holidays I first noticed a dramatic change in Jo. She was definitely slackening off. Her chores were not done in her usual quick and efficient way. She was snappy with her younger brothers. Her young face was etched in lines I could not understand, and she was not happy. She still spent her spare time on the roof under the fig tree, and it was only after these spells in her sanctuary that she would resemble anything like her former self, though not for long. I also noticed that it was becoming increasingly difficult to arouse her from her reverie from the top of the roof, and when I did, her eyes were glazed and unfocused for a long time. I was not ashamed to admit she was beginning to frighten me, not because I feared my safety around her, but because she was so distant and seemed otherworldly. I confided in Jeremy then. He tried to alleviate my fears, and to a certain extent he was successful. However, there was still that niggling doubt that something I couldn't control was happening to my daughter. I let it ride. I should have consulted a doctor or a psychiatrist or anyone. I didn't. Gradually it became the norm for Jo to be snappy. Her happy moments were a godsend. We seemed to forget the old Jo, for the new Jo had taken her place so completely. It was about this time I thought she might be on drugs, so I searched her room. Nothing. I searched her cottage. Nothing. I was at a loss. Then it was summer. The holidays began and the temperature rose. Somehow Jo seemed her usual self. I became more and more convinced school was the cause of all her troubles. I began to be grateful for the next few weeks when I could have my old Jo back, and at the same time I dreaded the start of a new school year, a scant 6 weeks away. My mind convinced me the new and dreadful Jo would return with the first day of school. Christmas came and went, and still the temperature soared. That fateful day started out ordinarily enough. Jo came in from the milking, commenting on how hot it was. I had done what I could toward the day's meals. The bread dough was rising, and breakfast was all set. The whole family had a wonderful meal together, lots of joking and tomfoolery that often accompanied the meal times of a large family. There was no hint of anything amiss. It was the boys' turn to clean up after breakfast that day, and since Jo's chores had been completed before breakfast, she was excused. As was normal for Jo, she retreated to her cottage. She was still there several hours later, happily sketching. The expression on her face was tranquil, and her whole body glowed with the light of pure joy. I had never seen her so relaxed. I saw her sketch afterwards, and it has since been a source of comfort to me, but I had no idea of its importance and significance then. Jeremy needed her to slash the back paddock. Away from her cottage, the tractor was her next favourite place to be, something to do with total solitude, I believe. Jo always took a lot longer to do tractor chores than any other, possibly because she was not required to do them as often, and relished the moments. She was not old enough to drive a motor car, of course, but driving a tractor on our property represented a total freedom for her. My older children, from 9-year-old Harry to 15-year-old Samantha, took their turns on the tractor, but Jo was the only one who really appreciated the freedom it provided. Plastered with sunblock and armed with sun hat, Jo took off, whistling tunelessly for the wild green yonder. She was gone for more than 4 hours before I began to worry. Even for Jo, that was a long time to do a quick slash of a 2-acre paddock. Not wanting to alarm anyone, I left the house under the guise of seeking some solitude, and headed off toward the back paddock. It was nearly midday, and the temperature had been steadily rising. There was not a cloud in the sky to offer relief from the intense heat, and the stark blueness and unrelenting glare were painful to my eyes. Still, I had to check on Jo. I hadn't been able to see the tractor from the veranda, which wasn't unusual, as the land undulated gently between the house and the paddock. What was more unsettling was that I couldn't hear the tractor, even as I approached the paddock. I told myself that the hills could mask the sound, but as I climbed the last hill overlooking the paddock, the tractor was still nowhere in sight. I stood for a moment unsure of what to do next, or where to start looking. The paddock was completely fenced. I stood by the gate, the only way in or out apart from climbing the fence. I knew the children sometimes wandered further than the back fence, but no gate was needed there. I began to feel disoriented. My thoughts were wandering to irrelevant subjects. I wanted to focus on the situation at hand, but I didn't want to think where Joe could be. Slowly I looked around the paddock. There were 4 boundaries, one through which I had entered the paddock, the far fence, which was sparsely lined by tall gums, the border of the road, and the back fence. This fence was at the bottom of a small gully, and was totally hidden from my view by a row of weeping willows. The other boundaries of the paddock were visible from where I was standing, and I could see nothing out of the ordinary there. I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread which had begun to overcome me when I started out to search for her. Jo was a big girl, I told myself. She could look after herself. These thoughts were getting me nowhere. I sighed loudly, surveyed the paddock once more, and started for the back fence. I needed to start somewhere. As I neared the gully, the feeling of dread grew stronger. I knew something bad had happened. The closer I came, the stronger the sense was, and I began to run. I stopped short to catch my breath. I couldn't believe Jo was not there. I think I panicked then. Memories of my subsequent actions were vague and distant. I must have found something, because when I came to my senses I was pummeling Jeremy's chest with my fists, my ashen face contorted with fear, screaming at him to find Jo, and when I stood back there was blood all over his shirt. I remember staring horrified at the stains, and then I looked at my hands and found them covered in what appeared to be the same blood. Jeremy grabbed me roughly by the shoulders, shook me violently in a tried and true effort to knock some sense into me, and demanded to know what I had seen and where. In a daze I led him to the back fence. There was the tractor, upended at the bottom of the gully, tangled in a web of barbed wires. Jeremy ran down to the tractor to see if there was any sign that Jo had even been there. He found a smeared pool of blood on a rock on the other side of the fence, with a few strands of what appeared to be Jo's raven hair matted in it, but little else. We could do nothing until we had called the police, but we would conduct our own search while we waited for them to arrive. Police thoroughly searched the area immediately around the tractor and for about a kilometre either side, paying particular attention to the neighbouring paddock, the gully and the creek that ran through it. For many hours, police and volunteers scoured the entire region. They even called in trackers, who could also pick up no trace. There were no tracks or disturbances of any kind, apart from our own, or anything at all unusual, except in the vicinity of the upturned tractor. For all intents and purposes, Jo had been injured. Police blood tests had since proven the blood was Jo's, and had just vanished. They eventually called off the search. Police questioned each of us in turn, starting with me, as it seems I could be considered a suspect. I had been the last to see her and the first to find her gone. That really was the last straw for me. I loved my daughter. I couldn't hurt her. We simply couldn't find her. When I could, I escaped to the relative sanctity of Jo's cottage. It was dark, but a golden moon shone through the gaping windows and doors, bathing the cottage in a haze of ethereal beauty. I held Jo's notebooks in my hands, unable to read them for the lack of light, but wanting to somehow understand Jo from them. Jo's notebooks are still in her cottage. I often go there now just to be near her. It's become a sort of shrine, somewhere to remember my daughter, somewhere to wait for the answer to her disappearance. Pride of place on the only solid wall in the cottage is the sketch Jo was working on the day she disappeared. I framed it a little while ago with some old wood from the Moreton Bay fig. It's a sketch of my Jo, eyes closed against the pane, an angelic expression on her face, rising above the world on wings of fire, being carried to the peace and sanctity she so desperately craved in her short life. My home in the hills is no longer magical. I hate it here now, and always will. But how can I leave? When I speak of my daughter, it's as if she is dead. I think she must be, but I don't want to think of her as dead. I don't know where she is, or if she died. I don't know how. She must be somewhere. Someone must know. Surely. Nobody can just disappear like that. Did you, Jo? I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please subscribe to my channel and share it around, the more the merrier. If you enjoyed the story and want to own your very own copy of one of my books, please visit my webpage or check out the links to my books on Amazon in the description below. I'll see you next time. Thank you.